Well, I'm live at the Red House with my friend Tori Elliott. Thank you for coming over.
Thanks for having me.
So yeah, you were as we were just discussing, you were one of two episodes that I taped of the precursor for this, the Zoom version of this that was like the remnants of the Red House Songwriter Sessions.
Yeah.
I'm very glad to finally have you on like the Real Deal podcast.
I know. I'm happy to be here. And I loved the Zoom session too, by the way.
Oh, good.
I felt very official to be interviewed on Zoom.
Yeah, I guess it was, but you know, I love this as an outlet to be able to like actually see my friends in person again, even though it's one at a time and all this stuff. It's just fun to like hang with artists and creative weird people.
For sure. I love it.
So we're going to talk about some obvious stuff and then who knows what else. But the exciting thing that is the most pressing thing to talk about is that you just released a single and you have new music kind of coming out ongoing.
Yes. I just released a single called Over My Shoulder, which is a song that I wrote with Charlie Hunter, who is a guitarist, producer, yada, 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 all the good stuff. And he and Stephen Price and I kind of wrote this project together, a 9-song project that'll come out this fall. And so we released the first single off of that album, I guess like 2 weeks ago, maybe. Yeah.
Over my shoulder.
Over my shoulder.
Yeah.
Over my shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been hearing a lot about this guy, Charlie.
Yeah.
And, I have yet to meet him. I'm supposed to be playing at the Flatiron this month.
Oh, yeah.
So might still meet him, but like I don't really know the whole story, but that just like changed hands very recently.
Yeah. They just got a new owner, which I met the new owner very briefly. I was there for a show last month and I met him, and he seems very nice and passionate about making the place even greater than it was. So,
Well, cool.
Yeah.
Good deal. And of course you work a lot with Stephen Price.
Yep.
So you said y'all you co-wrote this whole album?
I co-wrote the whole album with Charlie. Yeah.
Charlie.
So I kind of came up with these demos, lyrics and melody, and then he and I came together. He and Steven and I came together, and Steven would track while Charlie and I just kind of like ripped the songs apart. Charlie, revamped a lot of the chord structures, and we went in and changed some time signatures and, changed the roadmap of the songs, and then we tracked them together. Yeah.
Was it easy to like let somebody have that room?
Yeah. Well, for this project, it was because Steven had actually approached me before I ever met Charlie, but I knew who Charlie was. And he had said, would you be interested in doing a project with me and Charlie? And I was like, yeah, of course I would. And so then a few months later, he was like, okay, write a song and send it, and then I'll just like show it to Charlie. So I wrote 2 songs with having in mind that Steven and Charlie would produce them. And then after we tracked those 2 songs, Charlie was like, okay, go home and write an album's worth. And so then I wrote everything with them in mind. So it's not like I had these like songs that I'd been holding on to since I was 21 and I was like, you can't have my baby. It was like, I am creating this so that we can work on it together. So that letting go was a really easy experience in that sense.
Did that change the approach to the writing as far as like subject matter and like the things that you were drawn to write about, or even the sounds that you were drawn to play with? Did it change anything approaching it that way?
Yeah, I think it did, actually. I think that it actually took the album in a really fun direction, because when I've either had Steven produce before, which Steven is a good friend of mine, or if I've done stuff on my own, or if I've been producing a project, it's easier to like immediately get really blatantly vulnerable. And I didn't know Charlie. Like the first day that we met to go over songs, like that was the day that we met. We had one phone call before then. And so the first batch of songs that I wrote they're just kind of more fun, and then they kind of got a little bit deeper as I got to know him and felt more comfortable in that way. But it definitely it changed the subject matter. And then and as far as sounds go, I think that I knew, like, I was familiar with other projects that Charlie had done. I was familiar with his style of playing. And so I knew that I needed to do something a little more soulful and less indie pop. And so that was a really fun challenge in that sense too.
Yeah, I bet it would be.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Well, that's very cool. So, I mean, you're releasing music. I'm guessing it was a fruitful endeavor. I'm guessing it all went well.
It all went well. Peachy keen.
Good. Tell me about this video that you just put out with the flying and whatnot.
Yes. Well, so my dear, dear, dear friend, Beth Fletcher, she and I met each other when she, I think, was like maybe in her second year at School of the Arts. She went for directing and filmmaking. And so I like kind of watched her figuring out how to do her thing and like come up with these wacky ideas. And she like watched me as I was like starting Victoria Victoria and playing my first batch of shows and all of that. So she and I have worked several times together on music videos. She did the Body Body music video. She did the Sanctuary music video. She did the What to Do music video. And it's like with each music video, we've gotten a little more bizarre, which is like, that's Beth. That is like 100% Beth. And I've just been like, yeah, let's do it. And so I had sent her the project when I just had the demos, and I was like, hey, listen to these and pick out a couple songs you'd want to work on. And she picked out Over My Shoulder, and she was like, I'm seeing you flying. And I was like, whatever, dude, let's make it happen. So it was really cool. It was like a back workout because I was in front of this, I guess it was like a rear projected, I don't know. It was like a screen, but they were projecting the sky from behind.
Yeah.
And they had me on a yoga ball, and my feet were tethered to the ground, and I had to like prop myself up to like wiggle around and everything. And I was like, dang, I guess I need to work out my core a little more. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. Beth came up with like the storyline, the ideas, all of it. And then I was just like, tell me what to do when. And
very cool.
yeah.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
So is this inspiring you to get a yoga ball and work your back out more?
Well, I did get a Y membership.
Cool.
Shortly after that. I'm not, I don't really like the big yoga balls, but I have been working on my core because my doctor says that when you get old, that is what people need to work on the most. Like if you have a stroke, you are more likely to recover if you have core strength than if you have like leg strength or arm strength. So working on my core strength.
I hear that. And like, are you you're in your 30s?
20s.
20s? Lucky you. Yeah, I've recently entered my 30s within the last 2 years or so. And exercise is a son of a bitch to like work into your lifestyle.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. And I think too, like, not to get too deep or anything, but I have just had a really tricky history with exercise and dieting and all of that. And just realizing like this is something that I actually need to do, but also it can be to my detriment if I'm going at it in this like bad mindset. And so, or the wrong mindset, I should say. So it's been actually really challenging, but fun in the last couple of years, figuring out how to get in physical activity without it being like to live up to society's standards.
Yeah.
image wise. But anyway, I really like the Y. I like that they have a women's only workout room because I used to work out at Planet Fitness, and creepy old men would follow me around in there. Like, why do men come to the gym fully dressed in like khakis and a fedora and dress shoes, and they're like sitting at the machines? Like,
That happens?
it happens. And those are the men that follow you at Planet Fitness. Watch out. Okay. Viewer beware. Wow. We really got off subject very quickly. But anyway, so Planet Fitness, creepy old men.
Yeah. I never go to a gym at all. I always try to do everything here.
Nice.
And I've not mastered how to work it into my life at all. I'm trying to.
Well, you live kind of far out too. So even if you did go to like a gym, that'd be like a whole endeavor.
Yeah.
Which is like...
Well, actually, there's a Y a couple miles north. So going anywhere into Winston would be kind of rough. But going north, it's a little easier.
I do like the Y.
Yeah.
I'm going to take up swimming next, I think.
Yeah?
Yeah. Apparently that's really good for your joints.
You're thinking ahead.
I am really thinking ahead.
You really are.
I am. I want to age as gracefully as possible.
Yeah. Also, the benefits, I think, to the creative mind.
Yeah.
Too, you know, like it's something I think I've taken for granted a lot. Like the benefits of just running around occasionally to like clear your brain out.
Yeah.
You know,
it's so true. I think that I was always so like artistically focused, even as a kid. So like drawing and painting, playing music. And I was never good at sports. And it was really embarrassing for me to like try and do any physical activity just because there was no grace to it or like skill at all. And in my adult life, I've like leaned really hard into the internal creative aspect, but there was like no mind-body connection there at all. And I think that the more active that I've gotten, in a healthy way, that it has actually like helped me embody creativity more fully, and it not just be this like mental process, but it's like I can actually like feel what I'm writing about, and it's been a really cool process.
that makes a lot of sense to me. I relate very differently. Like growing up, I did play a lot of sports when I was like younger and stuff. And it was almost like my senior year of high school, I replaced sports with the arts.
Yeah.
And it was like music was always like a secondary interest until that point, and then it was like it became that and writing became like the primary thing in my life.
Yeah.
So it was almost like I pushed sports aside, and I think ever since then, I haven't really thought about it till this conversation, but I think since then it's been like part of the reason that I have a harder time like working exercise back in is because I feel like it occupies the same space as music in some way, or creativity. So that's interesting.
It is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I feel that, like feeling like it occupies the same space and like you have to choose. I just have found that, especially with the busier that I've gotten, and even just with like COVID and being shut in for so long, that it's like worth it for me to forfeit some creativity time just to move around.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a few times a week. Like it helps with depression and stress and all of that, and just my overall mood and existentialism. So
You've been running into a lot of that lately?
yeah, I mean, who doesn't? Does that go away in your 30s?
So far it hasn't.
Okay, great.
I think
I'll check back in.
it's shifted a little, but I feel it shifting heavily, but I don't know if I associate that with age or with like the state of the world that we live in right now. But like my desires related to existence have been changing pretty hard lately, like noticeably.
Yeah.
Things like what's things like this, like lifestyle, like what's important to be in your life, what's not. Like is it important for me to, if I'm going to have a social life, is it important that it's like downtown among people I disagree with who want to like drink a lot? Or is it more important to like rethink what my social life looks
Yeah.
like, how much I drink
Yeah.
alcohol, like whether I have a garden or not, whether or not I try to do things I mean to do, shit like that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel it. I feel it all.
Yeah. Last time we talked for the Zoom thing,
Mm-hmm.
we did get to talk a little about like what you were reading about, and,
Yeah.
like religious stuff and Winnie the
Mm-hmm.
Pooh and different things like that.
Yes.
I was very curious to follow back up with you on that.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on in that department of your life.
Yeah, well, since we've spoken, or wait, no, maybe I already was. You know, I'm a licensed reverend.
No,
Yeah,
I had
well,
no idea.
here you go, everybody. So I'm a licensed reverend in the yeah, in the United Methodist Church,
Okay.
and so I still I had a lot of continuing education for that this past year. So I read a lot of interesting things just about Christian theology, but I have been more interested. Like, one of my best friends is Jewish, and so she's given me like articles and books and things to read, because I think with the like, especially I grew up in like non-denominational charismatic churches, and there was not really any curiosity about what else is out there. It's kind of, I mean, because you grew up with a Christian background too,
Mm-hmm.
that it's kind of looked down upon. Well, I don't mean to speak for you, but there can be a sense where it's looked down upon to like look into anything else.
Yeah.
Or, and so it's been really interesting to talk to my friend Maya, who is Jewish and spent a lot of time in Israel actually, and has traveled the world way more than I have, and just has even a more diverse friend group as far as like backgrounds go. And so we've had a lot of interesting conversations, and she's passed off some reading material, although I don't think I've actually finished any of it. But yeah, so that's been really interesting, and I feel like that has kind of even combated some of the existentialism that I can fall into as well. Just like realizing that a lot of this might not make sense in the context of what we're talking about, but like that there are a lot of people out there who want to have each other's back despite like cultural differences or different religious practices or faith spaces. And yeah, so that's been interesting. Was that even the question? I can't remember what you asked me. Oh, checking back in on all of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been interesting.
Sounds like it. I think there's a lot here we can talk about. I think it'll be interesting to see where we land. But yes, so I come from a Baptist background.
Yeah.
I think I do understand the hierarchical sort of thing you were talking about. That's sort of like, for me, I definitely grew up with a sense that like there was of course, we in our denomination considered ourselves to be correct and most correct, but like it just went down from there to like there were certain people that were way less incorrect than others, and like somebody like a Methodist, we assume, would be less incorrect than somebody like a Catholic.
Yes.
Down the line.
Yep.
But that was just to contextualize myself. I'm curious to ask like how you, I guess like, well, let's just start simple.
Mm-hmm.
You are, what'd you say, licensed reverend?
Yeah, so I'm not ordained.
I see.
Which means that like my duties can only be legally fulfilled within my county, I think. I hope that no one who's in charge of me is watching this, because I should definitely have a clearer picture. But it's like I'm appointed to a congregation, and like if I'm performing a wedding or something like that, which I haven't done before, but if I were to do that, it couldn't be outside of the county. I can't do like destination weddings. I'm not supposed to like perform a funeral outside of the state, like things like that. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I get the impression from knowing you to the degree that I do that you like faith is something you've grown up around and within,
Yeah.
and that it has mattered to you.
Yeah.
So like, I guess how did you end up? What led you to find yourself to be a licensed reverend?
I don't know. No, I do know. I do. I look back on the course of my life a lot of times and I'm like, how the hell did I end up here? But I, like I said before, I grew up in like non-denominational, really charismatic churches, like very proud to not be associated with a denomination and all of that. And there was a lot of emphasis on like spiritual freedom, but I actually feel like I experienced the opposite of that a lot of times, and especially being a woman in a faith space. And yeah. So anyway, the older that I got, there were several points in time where I was very close to walking away from faith altogether, just because I felt very burnt out, and like the points of the gospel that I felt emphasis on were not emphasized, and it got to the point where it felt like it was more about who was right and who was wrong, and less about like, the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is talking about who we're supposed to be serving and how we're supposed to be making a difference in the lives of the people around us. So I ended up just taking this job leading worship at this United Methodist congregation when I was in my early 20s. And the theology, the more that I read about it, the more that it kind of lined up with what I grew up thinking was true, even though I had heard the opposite of that. And there are, there were congregations that I came in contact with that are like affirming of the LGBTQ community, and like inviting and like actively, like offering anti-racism classes and things like that. Whereas in the I guess United Methodist is still evangelical, but in the spaces that I grew up in, it was almost like those things were very much so demonized. And so for the first time, it felt like I didn't have to choose between the two, that they belonged together, So, I just had people encouraging me to start taking these licensing classes and enter into a process of candidacy. And I was going back to school anyway, which I'm still finishing my undergrad. And that's kind of a more complicated, it's a little all over the place. So that's why when I say, I don't know, but here I am.
Yeah.
And I really love the aspect of like sitting with people in pain and sitting with people who are experiencing questions and doubts, and like some of the things that made me feel like I wanted to die because of what I had been taught when I was growing up. Like, that sounds so extreme, but just these thoughts that we have as humans, like, well, I don't know, is there anybody out there? Like, is there a God? Is this right? And when I was in my teenage years and as a young adult and those questions would come up, it would literally make me feel like, oh God, I can't, like, I would rather die than face those questions. And to be able to sit with people in those questions and not even necessarily offer them answers, but just be like, yeah, yep, it's part of the human experience. Feels really gratifying for me to be able to do that in the role that I'm in. So I don't know what the future holds as far as all of that. But I do know that it's been really fulfilling, in the past couple of years. So
Yeah. Well, that on its own is great to hear. Just
yeah,
fulfillment in anybody's life
for
is
sure.
just like it's rare to find. It feels
Yeah.
like. So that's great. So I guess one question that comes to mind with all of that is like, uh, what is that? What is it? It do those spaces like you as a creator and a creative, and also like this space of like service or something in some kind of
Yeah.
way. Do those occupy similar spaces? Do they have stuff in common with one another, or are they different from one another?
Um, they're very different from one another, but I do feel like I am getting closer. Like the older that I get, I feel like I'm more able to move between or from one and the other more fluidly, whereas before it felt like I needed to keep them completely separate, or like hide one area from the other, and it doesn't necessarily feel that way anymore. But they are very different in the sense of like, being in a faith space, like there's so much ritual there, and there's like an order that you do things in, and people are seeking ritual to keep themselves sane and to feel connected spiritually to something bigger than themselves. And I think that essence carries over to like what I do with Victoria Vicxtoria and music. Like when I'm attending shows, when I'm going to hear someone that I admire as a musician, I am desiring spiritual connection in some way or another. I'm desiring to feel connected to something bigger and beyond where I am, or I'm desiring comfort or fun or, all of these things, which I view as spiritual practices. And so I do like to carry that sense over when I'm performing, and realizing that like it's an honor that I get to play my music for anyone. And it's also, in some sense, it feels like an act of service in ways. So I think that that's where the crossover is. But yeah, but I think the biggest separator is that you will find typically within, especially in the Bible Belt and in the South, you find at a church a group of people who very much think the same way in a lot of aspects, maybe not always, but in a lot of ways. And the thing that I love about playing shows is that you just get a way more diverse crowd. Like there are people from all different faiths, all different walks of life, all different life experiences, and they're able to come together in this space under the pretense of music. So yeah.
That's a very good answer.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I think the church comment you made, like, I mean, that makes obvious sense
Yeah.
when you think about the what the role is that church is doing, and like the fact that
Yeah.
they're broken into denominations suggests that they're at least bound by some set of beliefs that they have in common.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said about like what music is and how that experience has some overlap with this, with the spiritual realm. I
Yeah.
like that's such an interesting thing that so many people could articulate or describe in different ways. But
Yeah.
the way you did it just made a lot of really good sense.
Oh, thank you.
Another obvious question I had before I forget it was about the denomination of Methodist. I almost said
Yes.
Moravian, but Methodist. What are the distinguishing characteristics of this whatever theology or denomination or whatever however
Yeah.
you'd say that?
Well, the first one that I noticed when I first started attending a Methodist church was that they ordain women, which is something that is missing in a lot of, I guess I can only speak for Christianity because that's all that I grew up with. But yeah, that was the biggest thing that I noticed. And the more that I learned about it, there's like it. So the guy who started the Methodist movement was John Wesley. And the biggest thing that I took from his sermons that he wrote, which are honestly really hard to read through because they're from forever ago. But anyway, I still had to read them. But he had this line where he said, like, in essentials, unity, and then in non-essentials, we let people think, which was one thing that really captivated me because, but then with that, oh, sorry, I'm doing the thing where I'm verbally processing, but then the thing with that is that people disagree on what the essentials are. Mm-hmm. But that was something that I really liked because it's supposed to be a space where people who have different beliefs can come together and still support one another and still connect to God together in some sort of community setting. Right now, sometimes it can feel like that's harder to happen, especially just with like the way that the world is and everything that's going on. And then even like regionally where we are, being in the Bible Belt, being in the South. But I do like that, like what we teach is supposed to encourage that. And, yeah. And then like the other things that like would probably be boring to you are like the differences on like baptism and communion and like all of that, like what we believe about that. But
I mean,
so like we baptize babies,
right,
which Baptists don't.
right.
We didn't either in my non-denominational church. It was believers baptism only, which you're operating that like once you understand what's happening, that's when you can get baptized.
Yeah.
The Methodists teach that you couldn't possibly comprehend what God does at your baptism, so you can go ahead and sprinkle your baby and you're good to go. But then there are some people who are like, but the baby's not giving consent to baptism, so then what do you do with that? So there's a lot of interesting, I mean, I delve into rabbit holes with all this stuff, but the United Methodist denomination, yep, we baptize babies. With communion, I grew up, again, in my like charismatic church being taught that it's like a symbol of remembrance. And then the Catholic Church, I think it's called like transubstantiation or something like that, where they believe that the bread and the wine literally turn into Christ's body and blood, which I have an extreme fear of cannibalism, like accidentally committing cannibalism. So I could have never been Catholic, which we can talk about that later if you're interested. There's a word for it, but I can't remember. Anyway, that's why I can't eat meat. Anyway, but the Methodists are kind of somewhere in the middle. And so they teach that it is not only an act of remembrance and it doesn't literally turn into the body and blood of Christ, but that it is like a transformative spiritual sacrament that you partake in. So it's really important that people partake in communion together because it's supposed to strengthen like your spirit and renew you and in your communion with God.
Yeah. So the more I talk to the more I talk to people, it sounds like a lot of the non-denominational churches are like they have a lot in common with Baptist churches.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that kind of across the board usually?
I don't know. I think the one that I grew up in, one of them that I grew up in definitely like had leaned kind of more towards, honestly, it was kind of like a blend of like Baptist and then some Methodist, like Wesleyan kind of tradition. But then there was like another church that I grew up in that I think was like more taken from the book of like Pentecostal, but like it was kind of like a holy roller church. Very interesting experience, but that was the one I went to as a teenager. So again, that was like non-denominational, but didn't really have a lot in common with the Baptist church, except maybe the preaching style was still kind of that like somewhat fire and brimstone. Like, I'm going to yell at you until you get it. And then this is the way that it is. And so,
Yeah. As we're talking through some of this, I often have to ask myself like why I'm still so interested in this subject. As you like, when you met me, I was like deep in an atheistic phase or whatever, and you know I've bounced around it a lot, and it's so fascinating the way that like, we outwardly and explicitly like choose this thing that has to do with our identity. Because in most cases, I think and even still, it's like we're persuaded toward it for some reason. But in most cases, our identity is like an accident to us. It's like, I don't know why I like to do this sport or why I like this food or whatever, but we still identify with all these things. But with religion, it's like almost like a chosen, protected, like, I have to identify with this thing, not because I actually have to, but it means that much to me to continue to identify with it. I think it's really interesting that we do that.
It is it's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating. And I have a lot of friends now who grew up either in the same church that I did, or, you know, we were friends in our early 20s and like served at the same church together or whatever. And a lot of them have left faith altogether. And in a lot of ways, I feel like I can kind of relate more to them than I can to my friends who are still Christian. Because I understand like being in that place of asking those same questions, like, why am I here? And why are there so many questions that I haven't been allowed to ask for the entirety of my existence in this tradition, you know? And, so it is really fascinating, and even fascinating to think that like one thing that's really interesting to me is that, so Ethan, my husband, he, his parents grew up Mennonite, which is like, so they're from like Amish country. And then some of his family is still Amish. Some of them are still Mennonite, but some of them are still Amish. And okay, I might be getting this wrong, and I'm like doing the thing where like we're going to post something that I'm talking about, like I know what I'm talking about, and so I'm just saying I don't actually know, but I think that the Amish do this thing where they let their teens or like young adults or whatever, they have a year where they can go out and experience the world, and then at the end of that they decide whether or not they come back, or like if they still like believe in any of that, or
that's the Ramspringa thing.
Yeah.
It is one of those Mennonite or Amish. I think Amish is what I think
it's Amish. I don't think that Mennonite. I don't think it's a part of like the Mennonite thing.
Yeah.
But I do think that the Amish do that, and it's just interesting to me that something that seems like, to me from the outside looking in, like, I look at the Amish and I'm like, that's about rules, right? There are like things that you have to subscribe to in order to be a part of that community. And that someone so entrenched in that would willingly let their young people go off and experience like anything outside of it. When I was growing up, it was like, do not think about other possibilities. Do not look into anything that even looks like a different religion. Do not you don't even talk to people who have a different religion than you unless it is with the goal of converting them. Mm-hmm. And there was just never that sense of like, yeah, go off and see what happens. And for me, I'm like, well, then do y'all even really believe like what you're talking about if there's this fear that the smallest thing can shake what you're teaching your kids? Like if you really feel like they're going to go off to college and that they're going to turn out to be, you know, whatever, that's your worst nightmare, then how much power is behind, like, are you actually, like, do you believe what you say that you believe, or are you like subscribing to fear-based antics? I don't know. It's just things that I think about a lot.
I feel that really strongly, especially after there's like years of navigating conversations with different
Yeah.
people of faith, and it's like I have found that the people that I admire the most are usually those who are like this close to changing their beliefs,
Yeah. Yeah.
like by 180 degrees.
Yeah.
People who are just like people who have the hardest time finding
Yeah.
certainty about anything, and the people who I have at least less productive conversations with tend to be those who like speak with this language of I have I have all the answers with this concrete certainty,
Yes.
yet I've never explored the antithesis. I've never even entertained the possibility
Yeah.
of the antithesis. That always has really, I've always found it really noticeable, and it's always really bothered me. Not out of like judgment of other people. It's more so for me coming from a place of I can't trust the conclusion that we're like talking about right now
Yeah.
if there's certain aspects of thought that can't be played with.
Yeah.
If we can't play with certain possibilities, then we're not having a full conversation.
For sure.
That's bothered me.
Well,
over
it
the years.
bothers me too, because it feels like when you're having conversation with people like that they are requiring more of you than they are willing to give. And so what they want from you is for you to question everything and to look at your life and say, well, maybe this isn't working out and maybe there's something more to this. But they are fundamentally unwilling to do the same thing. And I know that because I was one of those people.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
especially as a teenager. Like
Yeah.
I just remember, I remember having those conversations in high school, and I remember
yeah.
having those conversations in high school, and I just remember like simultaneously feeling so like on my high horse and also terrified, because it's like, please God, don't let them say the one thing that's gonna like trip me up. And I mean, that's why, like, well, I won't say too much about it, but anyway, I don't want to get myself in trouble. But I do think that there's a gross double standard a lot of times in those conversations, and I have compassion and empathy for people who are in that place, because I know what it's like to grow up thinking that that's what you have to do in order to be a decent human being.
Exactly.
So yeah, I have empathy for people in those places, but it is really hard to have conversation unless both parties are willing to budge.
I hear you completely, and likewise, it's like, it is often the case. I think that we like in life in general. It's not just within this subject, but in life in general. There's that quote that I can't think of where a lot of time what you see in somebody that bothers you is a reflection of something that bothers you about yourself.
Yeah.
And for me, it's very clear and obvious that like the issue I take with people that are that stuck in that parameter or whatever, that sort of box they live in. I'm frustrated that I used to live in it and that I was so dishonest about it. I remember having conversations that make me cringe so hard now. The first time I made friends with like an atheist, and the conversations that me and my other like kind of religious friends that had only ever been exposed to our own ideas.
Yeah.
Conversations we would have with him, the weird like foxy accusations we would make, like oh, like he would be saying like, I don't think this is true, and that would be interpreted by somebody in the room as like, yeah, I also think that there's a lot of hypocrites in Christianity or something.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not what he's not criticizing Christians. He's saying he actually doesn't think it's true.
Yes.
And that was like impossible for us to hear.
Yes.
The idea that somebody didn't think the Bible was true.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because it was like, well, how could any of this be anything other than the New King James Version that we're reading? This is it. Yeah. I this whole conversation reminds me of a song that I wrote last year, or I guess maybe at the beginning of this year, that is not on this project, so none of you will hear it anytime soon. But I think that like because I've gone through like so many dark nights of the soul, and oftentimes when I've been going through those times in my life, I've still been actively involved in church to some extent. And this song that I wrote is about like those moments when you find yourself asking like these huge questions again that used to shake you to the core, and like that used to make me feel like life isn't worth living if this isn't what I thought it was. And how like in between those moments I have these encounters that I personally chalk up to being like encounters with God or encounters with the Spirit, where I have a conversation with a friend and like it feels holy, or like I have a moment at a show that feels like I don't know what's happening, but this feels like what worship should be, you know. And recognizing that like there were so many times in my life where when I would have those experiences, I would almost panic because it was like, but how long until I start asking questions again? And how long until this isn't enough? And I think I've come to this place in my life where when I'm having these experiences where it feels like I'm connected to God, it's like greeting an old friend, but not like with white knuckles trying to hold on to it, but just enjoying the moment while it's there. And I like this line that I wrote in the song is like, it was good to see your face again, even if I never see your face again. So recognizing that like, even if this is the last moment that I ever feel this way, and for the rest of my life, I'm in this like tumultuous like washing machine of what if I don't know, what if I don't know. Just learning to like, whatever this moment is, whatever this like sense of spirit is that I'm feeling, like I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to have that, and I'm grateful even for the experiences I had as a kid. Like even though some of those I mourn when I think about it, and I mourn the fact that like I was so close-minded even in conversation with people, or like things that I believed were actively hurting other people in my life. And I look back on that and it hurts me to think about it. But there were also moments where I felt like worthy of being a human, and I felt like loved by something bigger than me. And so I cherish those moments. And I think now as an adult, I just want to convey that to the people that I encounter as much as I can, without trying to force it to be something that I never had any business forcing it to be, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's really interesting to hear. And I'm glad that you brought back some of the positivity in the conversation, because I don't think it's necessary. I don't think either of us, obviously you don't, and I don't anymore, harbor like purely negative feelings for this subject. And that's, I think, a good segue into a curiosity. I'm asking you. I'm surprised by the questions that I'm asking you, because I didn't know that we were going to be in this territory.
It's
fun. You posted something, I think, like yesterday or something, that I wanted to ask about, especially given this part of the conversation.
Yes.
Like, I think the concept of something that I've noticed has been coming up a lot in the podcast is masculinity and femininity, how they relate, how they're different. And what I thought would be interesting to ask you is something like how that relates to the idea of the divine, and the concept of God, which I think we probably both grew up with, a masculine figure of God. And I noticed the other day that you posted something that like kind of had the feminine in it.
Yeah.
So anyway, what's your take on that these days?
Yeah. So those are what I posted yesterday was God the mother loves me. She tells me every night. My own mother told me to try and keep an open mind. And those are lyrics from Over My Shoulder.
Right.
And I wrote those lyrics after I had I can't remember. I think it was a sermon that I had preached, and I had talked about how someone that I knew who had grown up in church felt isolated from the church because he had a really terrible relationship with his dad. And so he saw God as a mother. But in the Bible, Jesus teaches us to pray as to God our Father. And that is what people love to just cling to, which I think in one sense is really beautiful, to think of God as like a parental figure, but also like we have to keep in mind that that was like a completely like patriarchal time. Like no one would have, Jesus wouldn't have taught to pray to God the mother, you know, whatever. So anyway, I didn't say any of that during the sermon. I know my limits. But I did say, like, you know, he felt isolated from the faith community he was in simply because he couldn't relate to God as a father. And that was 1 second in my entire sermon, and I got so much pushback on that one statement, that for him to connect with God, that he needed to connect with God as like a motherly figure. And I got so much pushback on that, and it made me really angry because, again, it's just kind of like that black and white thinking where there's like no wiggle room in spirituality, even though like people need wiggle room and people need to be able to connect spiritually in whatever way they can. And so from that, and this was years ago that this happened. And so I started exploring like what ways have my spirituality been affected because I have been taught that God is a man, even though God's not a man. Like why have I been taught that? And what ways does it affect the way that I see myself and the way that I see my spirituality? And so over the past probably 4 years or so, I think I've really been asking myself those questions, and even like really just looking at the ways that I either feel misunderstood or view myself as less than, or honestly even like view the feminine side of me as having to be separate from my spirituality because of that context. And over my shoulder, I wrote it about being a woman in faith spaces and feeling like how that has affected like my sensuality and my sexuality and the way that I present myself to the world, how I am so preoccupied with the way that other people perceive me, specifically in faith spaces. And so that's what this whole song is about. I don't really have any, like, again, there are no like concrete conclusions or answers that I've come to.
Right.
But it's been helpful for me to even reframe the way that I think about God. I mean, ideally, I would love to like primarily think about God as this like genderless being, but because I grew up thinking about God as a man only, it's actually helped for me to switch it and be like, okay, what does it mean to be like mothered by this spirit? And like, what does it mean to celebrate the fact that I'm a woman? Like, what does that actually mean? You know, what does it mean to even have that definition be broader than what I was taught being a woman was when I was growing up?
Mm-hmm. I find that really interesting. I think, I don't know, well, I'm sure you do. You know, there's a symbolic nature, I think, to the idea of masculine and feminine. Mm-hmm. And of course, like the spiritual traditions that go back so far that like derive different meanings from those symbols and stuff. And I think it's interesting to think about, I think, what we would call more masculine communities. Mm-hmm. And I would probably venture to guess that, in those like more rural communities or whatever.
Yeah.
That what you just said would be really foreign. A lot of that would be really foreign. The idea of
Yeah.
introducing the divine feminine into like more traditional spaces,
For sure.
compared to somewhere like the spaces like downtown where
Yeah.
people are just more. I don't know. They explore different things of that sort.
Yeah.
I find it interesting. Because it's not. You're not the first person I've talked to who's part of the downtown community who's like who seems to be like really directly, explicitly exploring the idea of the divine feminine or something. And that's what, I don't know how to put it perfectly into the question, but it's like, to me, in my mind, if there's such a thing as the divine, there's such a thing as the divine feminine and masculine. And then I wonder, like theologically, do those divine spirits exist in one entity, and that would be God conceptually, or are they separate entities?
Yeah. I think that the way that I view it is that it would be both in one, because I think that people can be both in one. And I think that when we try to say that there is one feminine spirit and there's one masculine spirit, that it kind of boxes us all in all over again, when it's like there are masculine aspects to my personality too. And they're just like with Ethan, like with my husband, like, yes, he's a man and he presents in a masculine way, but there are also feminine aspects to him as well. And so I tend to not really subscribe to the thought that there is like a divine feminine presence and a divine masculine presence. And I'm more so, again, going back, and this is like the Christianity aspect, where it's in Genesis, it says that we're made in God's, that God made us in God's image. And so to me, that means that there can be both in all of us, and that doesn't mean that there are like equal levels or whatever. Like, everyone is different and there's freedom within that. But I think that that's more so where I lean into. But again, that probably has more to do with my own upbringing and my own tradition. Like, I would be interested to speak with people who see it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think of this is just really funny to me. I just got done finishing the podcast that comes out tomorrow, the one that will precede yours by like a week, and this very subject came up, and I remember from editing it one part that I wish I had explored more. I'm going to explore with you, I guess, if I can.
Great.
It's a matter of definitions, I think, and a matter of what those definitions mean. So, like, do you know what you think, what masculinity consists of? Likewise with femininity, and whether or not that's thought, whether you conceptualize that as like a universal thing versus a culturally, what's the word I'm looking for? Culturally, what is the word that people say? Like means culturally dictated, but
yeah. Oh, hold on.
Constructed.
Yes.
Yeah. Socially constructed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so hold on. Ask me the question again.
Two questions, I guess. One being, what do you think masculine is and feminine is? If you have a definition, if you have descriptions for that, and then the second is whether or not you think it's like how we understand it, as for whether it's just like totally part of our culture, or if it's actually deeper than that and more universal, more like innate.
Yeah. I feel hesitant to even act like I have solidified thoughts on this, because there are people who literally like study this culturally and like have like master's degree in like gender studies or whatever. And but yeah, I think that the way that I've been thinking about it, or even having conversations with a lot of my friends who grew up in different backgrounds, I look at it as like a cultural thing a lot of the time. I mean, not entirely, because I do think that, like, I think that there is a difference between like what we perceive to be masculine and what we perceive to be feminine. But I personally feel like I've had a harder time like drawing a direct distinction between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people, like I have friends who are all about like, this is what divine feminine energy is, and like this
Right.
is what it means to me, and this is what it means to celebrate it. And I am interested, even like, I have a couple of people in mind where I'm like, I've really been meaning to get coffee with them and just be like, tell me what you're talking about. But because even then, like, I think that there's a big discussion right now again about like gender in general. And so like, how does that conversation fit in with the difference between femininity and masculinity? And you know, like if we're celebrating, like, I have a friend who is really interested in marking the significance of like having a period, when, you know, oftentimes like a menstrual cycle is what, like, we don't want to talk about that. Like, you know, like, God forbid you ask your partner to go into the store and buy tampons or something. Like, it's humiliating. Like, who gets a period, you know? Or like marking the significance of like carrying a child, or having a miscarriage. All I know is that for me personally, what it means to like lean into my femininity has a lot to do with unlearning things that I learned like within the sphere of purity culture. Did you get a healthy dose of that at all?
I wouldn't say a healthy dose. No.
I got more than my healthy dose, I think. And
I guess they'd call that an unhealthy dose.
it was an overdose of purity culture. And I think that as an adult, I've just realized the harm that can come from, you know, like I just remember being so ashamed of like having curves, because that meant that I would be a stumbling block to other men. And like,
wow.
Yeah. And like there were times, like I preached this morning and I talked about, well, I won't tell you the entirety of what I talked about, but I told this story of attending a church. I was like maybe 15 or 16, and wow, we're really going there. Anyway, you can cut this out if you want, but I was attending a church, maybe 15 or 16, and 2 different times. So I was leading worship at this church, singing, writing songs, playing every Sunday. And 2 different times there were men, grown men in their like mid to late 20s, who approached the pastor of this church and said, God told me that Tori is my future wife, which we would consider to be grooming, right? Yes. Luckily, they never approached me about any of this. I was literally a child. Yeah. But what happened was I got brought in to a room that had one of the pastors in it, a couple of other people who were in leadership at the church, and they told me what happened. And then the conversation then went, you, because you're talented and because you're gifted and because you're pretty, you need to watch how you present yourself so that you don't hinder the work of the Holy Spirit. So again, it was like put on me. Like looking back at those conversations, I still know a lot of those people that I had those encounters with. And I think that, or specifically the people that told me that, and I think that they probably wouldn't even say those things anymore. But I really internalized those messages where it's like, all that is good, me just being a woman can disrupt that. Like, the ministry of God itself can be thwarted by my femininity and like the effect that it has on men. And so in my adult life, I think that I've just been trying to unlearn that and to like claim it for my own, and less as it being something for other people, whether that be a good thing for them or a bad thing for them. So that was a very long answer for me to say that there is more to it than just my experience, but that is what I gather from that based upon my own experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of twists and turns.
Yeah. I really took us on a little magic carpet ride.
And a good one, and like a
Yeah.
valuable one for the conversation.
Thank you.
I appreciate it, and if as long as you're like comfortable with everything
Oh, yeah.
you've talked about,
Absolutely.
I'm comfortable. Like, you know, it's part of the conversation.
Yeah.
There were a few things that were touched on too. And one of them that's really interesting is like yeah, I'm reluctant for us to talk about this shit too. But one thing that's interesting to think on is just like the traditions that a lot of this language represents, and like the problems that it's trying to solve, and sort of what you and I are dancing around a little bit, which is this place we've reached where we're now struggling with the question of whether or not these concepts, the distinction between these things even has to remain, or also what it means in society when they're like totally flipped according to somebody's identity and stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're in like new territory as a collective trying to figure out what this all means.
For sure.
For some people it's very uncomfortable on both sides. Like it's the like, I mean, I would think that it's going to become more and more of a problem in the the traditional religions, which do have an emphasis on, on sex, pretty much.
Yeah.
That these conversations are going to get harder and harder to have, especially if we have a portion of society that's aiming for a middle ground where these distinctions no longer exist. And I think, like, you know, when we start talking about people who don't identify with the concepts of distinctions of people at all, you know, it gets a bit trickier. Second to that, I mean, that's just something I can mention, and I don't know if it's really a great idea for us to like talk about it in great detail. It doesn't matter to me, but it's just whatever feels. It's regardless of having a podcast and inviting people, that subject is still somewhat intimidating, and I don't know how deep we can go. But the second part about what you just kind of, you know, unpacked a little bit. Yeah. That is a great, I think, example of what people refer to. I get like I don't know where to take that exactly, other than like there's a cost of unfettered sort of like spaces that are nothing but masculinely dominated, I guess, that tend to run that unique risk of something like that, of something like interpreting a situation like that as like the male being the victim of having eyes in his head or some shit like that, and that like poor him, God has, I'm having a problem with God because of this or whatever. It's just, it's such an odd story that you just told, and so you said that from that experience, you've internalized that quite a bit, and like that's part of what you're sort of letting yourself loose from. Is that kind of right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, there was just a lot within that culture that, again, emphasized that, one, I guess the idea that like being sensual or sexual was only meant, one, it wasn't meant for you, it was meant for another person. And that if you did not check all of the boxes and you weren't super careful, then you would accidentally lead other people to think that that was for them. And so I think that like there was just so much shame in that for me for a really long time. And I mean, even into adulthood, like that caused a lot of problems for me, and just like socially and in relationships with other people. And Like that was one extreme instance that I talked about, but this idea was re-emphasized several times throughout my youth and even into young adulthood. Um, and it was all under the guise of like protecting yourself or protecting other people. But really, what it was is saying, like, what you have is shameful. And it's not even for you, it's for someone else. And you need to make sure that, like, you steward that as best you can. And that is just like sensuality and what I interpreted to be my own femininity. So yeah, it was just like really, it was an interesting, I think too, like a lot of my friends who grew up in these same circles as I did, I've gone back and been like, how did this affect you? And it affected us all in different ways. I have some friends who had really similar experiences. And then I have other friends who I think that they were just kind of like being sent those messages in their rebellious teen phase. But I was such a rule follower that it was like, okay, all right, well, like, tell me. Like, I never had the thing where I was like, I wanted to challenge that, or there was anything inside of me that thought that they might be wrong, you know? So, yeah.
So when you heard that, you accepted it as...
Oh, 100%.
I see.
100%. Yeah. And, yeah, like I even remember there was one time where I had gotten the lead in a school play when I was, again, like 15. And I was an underclassman and I got the lead and I had to kiss one of the guys in the play. And two of like the young adults pastors found out and they showed up at my house unannounced and sat down with me and they were like, this is grieving the Holy Spirit. You need to drop out of this play. Like the fact that anyone would watch you kiss another man that you're not married to, like absolutely not. Think about what that young man is going to feel. I mean, it was just like, again, it was all on me. There was no really room to even ask why. And I was like, okay. And then one of the lead pastors found out about it and then made them come back and apologize to me. So I stayed in the play. And
Really?
Yeah. But I felt right after that play, I got broken up with by my first ever boyfriend. This is so funny that I'm talking about all of this. I haven't talked about this in years. It's like therapy. But right after that play, I got broken up with by my first boyfriend, not because I kissed another guy, but just because I was extremely awkward and impossible to date. And I was 15. But I felt, again, like the pains of being young and being rejected. And I thought that that was punishment because I had done the play and kissed the guy. Isn't that crazy?
That's heavy.
It's wild.
Yeah, that's heavy.
So anyway, I can look back on those moments and like kind of laugh about them now at the absurdity of them. But that was stuff that like I carried with me even into adulthood and had to like actively and still to this day make choices to unlearn all of that, you know?
Yeah, I do. And I'm sure my stuff was like, I don't know, my stuff was way more in the intellectual space, I guess, like
for
unlearning how to, like, but pathologies pretty much, just unlearning pathologies. But yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's really hitting me in a particular way to hear, I don't know, like the way that these experiences took hold in your life and stuff. It's just, I don't know. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is very fascinating. Makes for some great songwriting material, though. I will tell you that.
Yeah, sure. Problems do. Conflicts do.
Conflicts do. It's true. Learning, growing.
I mean, yeah, I think for real, songs tend to be best if they're working out a conflict or whatever.
Yeah.
Or if there's a conflict within them. I do think that's really interesting that like your process of understanding all this stuff is kind of documented in this creative way. It's kind of awesome. I'll just share this with you. Who cares? I don't know. Whatever.
Whatever. I'm here for it.
Yeah. So like, as a male who's like been accused of being masculine before in my life, also somebody who doesn't identify with like movements or ideologies or religious identities or whatever. I know I think the reason I'm struck by this conversation is I'm having an internal conflict or whatever with all of that, because you're my friend and I empathize with all of that and I hear it all and I care about it all. And then like I think about where we are as a collective or something, and all of these messages and like what the appropriate roles in society are now and stuff like that. And I guess all I'm noticing is that like I care about that story you just told, and I care about everybody's experiences. And while caring about it, also struggle with the ideas in my own head about like to what degree like people my age and younger that are men are like feeling condemned in society.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm navigating right now. And
For sure.
It's just interesting. It's interesting to think about that.
Yeah. Well, I think too that one thing that I've noticed is that we, like, as humans, have a hard time living with nuance and living in a gray area. And I think that was what I ran into in my own spiritual journey. It's like everything was very black and white, and it was either this way or it was this way, and there was no room for nuance and no room for in between. And you can see that even in like our culture today. Like that even shows up a lot in like cancel culture, and this idea that like you say one wrong thing or you ask the wrong question or you whatever, and then like you're done. Like there's no room for growth. There's no room for a difference in opinion. And I think that like we can come alongside people and empathize in their experience, listen to where they're coming from, and also recognize that like there is room to see what else there is out there. And what I mean by that is like even saying that I do think that there are places where like men get demonized, or even I guess I don't want to say this for even like culture or whatever, because I can't speak for a broad group of people, but I can speak for myself in saying that like when I started to kind of come to these realizations of like how all of this stuff affected me, half of the people that told me those things were women. So it wasn't even like men were the ones. Like I grew up in churches with women pastors. Like I grew up in churches where women were able to be leaders. And so it wasn't even necessarily saying that like men were the cause of this pain that I'm feeling. And any time that I even felt tempted to believe that, it was really me kind of disassociating with my own experience and kind of jumping onto a bandwagon of like, men suck and they're the problem with society. When it's like, it's not that. Like I've known terrible men in my lifetime, and I've known some terrible women in my lifetime too. It's these ideas that we enforce and that we force upon other people. And I think that can go either way. Like for a really long time when I was really struggling with faith and questions and whatever, I thought that the source of all evil in the world was Christian men, white Christian men. And I was like, that is the source of everything wrong with the world. And then, you know, you start to hear other stories and you realize that like these broad statements that we make are, one, harmful.
Yeah.
And two, it actually silences people who have had other harmful experiences outside of myself. And how presumptuous is it for me to say all abuse, all harm, all of this comes from masculinity? All of it comes from masculinity. When I have friends who are abused by their mothers, and when I have, people who have had these other terrible experiences outside of what I've had, like what we end up doing is silencing other people. So for me, like, I think the older that I get, I am just not interested in making blanket statements. Like, I can really only speak to where I'm coming from, and I don't want to invalidate anyone else's experience either, because I know what that feels like too, and it doesn't feel great. And I think that when we are unable, no matter where we're at, if we are unable to listen to someone else, that's where the real turmoil comes in, because we just get into these like echo chambers of like our own voice, and that's all that we end up hearing. So anyway, that was kind of like a really long spiral rabbit trail, but
It was helpful, honestly. I mean, really, I appreciate everything you just said a lot, because like I think you just touched on some things that I hate to admit it. It's just like I sometimes, knowing that this is visible and knowing what time period we live in, yeah, sometimes I don't feel like I can talk as freely as I'd like to, and I like
for sure.
restrict a lot, or I hold back a lot, and like a lot of what you just said is what I think about a lot, and
Yeah.
it's like the danger of it's like this. I understand the necessary shift in maybe in people's minds, because I think people did feel like they were subjected to the authority of, I think, what feels to a lot of people like a at least more patriarchal society,
Yeah.
if they didn't think it was entirely that. So I understand why why it was so alluring for people to like get in touch with exactly what you just described, this belief that we've identified the problem with the world, and it's like white Christian men or whatever. Other people might use other descriptors
Yeah.
in that statement. And I have watched that be where we are for many years, and I've watched that take many faces. One of which that came to mind as you were talking, I remember at a college a couple years ago, like a men's event where they were going to discuss the issue of men's suicide, men's suicide, and why that rate is higher among men than it is among women. And like at that event, it was heavily protested by people who went to this college, and like there's footage of people, like men being basically harassed outside, like for wanting to attend this event. And some of the, like one in particular, I remember, I think a guy's like friend had committed suicide.
Man.
So he was there to like learn about that, and was, like being yelled at by people for it. And when we reach that point in society where we see it in such simple terms, perhaps necessarily for a transitional period, but I think now, like in this conversation, for example, like we're talking about reaching a point where we understand it better, and like we're not as unstable in that department. When we've reached a point in society where it's like, where that's happening, where people can't attend an event that's for their own mental health or something, because it's like, because we've defined men as some kind of enemy of the state, that's obviously too unstable. It's like obviously too exclusionary for it to be sustainable.
Absolutely.
It's unhealthy.
It is unhealthy.
Yeah.
It's very unhealthy. Yeah, that is very strange. And I had not heard about that, but I don't doubt that it happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that like if what we're desiring is progress, then just, writing out an entire group of people is probably not the way to go about achieving any of that progress.
Yeah.
And it just makes me think, like, I saw someone, the psychologist, talk about like the deconstruction movement and like I see on like TikTok all the time the hashtag exvangelical and like all of that, and people who are like divesting from Christianity. And this psychologist was talking about how she had seen this trend of people who, you know, the reason why they were leaving Christianity was because of how like rigid it was in their experience. But then what they ended up doing was creating a religion out of being a deconstructed Christian that became just as rigid. And there was no longer any room for anyone who believed in any religion, because if you did that, then now you were the enemy and you were the source of these things that happened to me when I was growing up. And yeah, it's just interesting to see that like that is, I mean, I guess it's like tribalism maybe is like the word, or I don't know. I've like heard it called different things, but it's just like this idea of like it seems to me like people will make like a religion out of anything.
Yeah.
Where it's like, this is the hard, fast rule, and you can't talk to me about anything other than what I'm saying right now. And in my experience, that has been harmful. And when I have subscribed to that way of thinking, I have probably been the least fulfilled and the most confused and the most bitter in my life that I've ever been.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Bitter is the word. And that's my beef with like where we are right now. I mean, I think the other word I think is ideology. I think I think the difference mainly between ideology and religion, because I think religions are often described as ideologies.
Yeah.
The only difference being whether or not you acknowledge that there's a God in it or not.
Yeah.
And it seems like in political ideologies, people don't call their highest conception of what is perfect. They don't call that God or whatever. And in religions, they do. So that's like a linguistic distinction between the two. But I think they really do function the same exact. I mean, I think they're documented to function in the same exact way in our psychology.
For sure.
And what I am noticing is like maybe this is a great ribbon to like start to, maybe we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for the conversation or whatever. But I wanted to know what you think. Like, it feels to me like a lot of people who were disenchanted perhaps with the perspective of like America and culture and religion, all this stuff, are just breeding bitterness now between them. There's a whole new ideology of just like, I'm going to be the opposite of everything that was ideal 20 years ago or whatever. For example, I'm going to put them on blast real quick, and this is just my take on it, my hot take, but you know, I've seen multiple people, and I get it to some degree, and I get that it's complicated, and I grant some flexibility, I grant some understanding to anybody who like feels strongly in this way or just disenchanted, because disenchantment is not something to be mocked, you know. But I've just seen a lot of people over the last 24 hours posting how like they're taking pride in, I'm not going to celebrate the 4th of July, for example, because I'm so not proud of America at all, or posting memes about like how much America sucks and all this stuff while benefiting from being a part of being here and all this stuff. Cranky's Coffee posted that exact sentiment about how they were going to be closed Monday, but they were going to not be celebrating the 4th of July. They weren't going to be celebrating Independence Day. They were just doing it for their own personal reasons. That's being bred by everybody, and it seems more rampant in people who don't know how to identify anymore with any of the like appreciation for the traditions, including the tradition of God.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your take on that is, and whether or not like the line, like maybe the line I'm drawing, but in the relationship there isn't necessary. Maybe religion, maybe God, maybe traditionalism doesn't save anybody from that stuff, from that like sort of hatred for society.
Yeah.
But I do start to get the feeling sometimes that if you practice like a man-made like intellectual religion or ideology in place of one that's like a tried and true traditional religion, I feel like that is like a byproduct of it, that bitterness and that sort of inability to relate to people comes from that, which I interpret as, I'm sorry, I'm trying to wrap this up, but
No.
I interpret that as like the religions honestly do try to do their best to worship that which is good.
Yeah.
And then when you lose that, you end up worshiping that which is not good.
Yeah.
That's my take. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry, I know I just threw you like
oh no,
a lot.
This is great.
That was a lot.
This is so great.
I didn't realize I had all those words in my head.
Well, I never want to knock anyone's like sense of protest.
True.
And I think that like if people truly feel that like their protest tomorrow, I've even seen people saying that they're like not spending any money from July 3rd to July 6th or something, like in protest of Roe v. Wade being overturned and these other things that are happening. And but I've also seen people talking about like the implications of that and like how that can also be disproportionate to like people who are poor and who don't have money. And, so anyway, I'm saying all of that to say that I never want to point a finger at someone and say, you're doing it wrong, especially when I don't want to come at it from an uninformed perspective, but what I have found is that anytime that anyone is saying, this is always the way it is, this is the only way to do things, if anyone tells you different, they are wrong. If anyone tells you, whatever, then they are just like a shitty human being. Then I'm like, okay, I mean, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. Just like if there is no room to budge here in conversation, then I'm distrustful of where this is coming from. Mm-hmm. And I think that like, man, I was listening to one podcast and I cannot remember for the life of me who was talking. Oh, I think it was a Barry Weiss podcast. Honestly, have you heard of that? Mm-mm. I really like it. But anyway, she had someone on there who was talking about how, like our modern desire to have like nothing to like live for or believe in is a sickness, and how, we've become so disillusioned with like life and a lack of hope for the future, and a disinterest in religion and all of that. And that like it can make us just sick with bitterness towards the world in general and cynicism. And again, like I do believe that I'm coming from a privileged perspective when I'm talking about this. So like if someone else who came to me and said, well, that's not my life experience and this is the way that I am, like I don't want to claim to have any answers. But I do think that like when I think about the future and I think about like wanting, my nephew to grow up in a world that is less racist and that is less sexist and that is less classist, I'm just not sure that the way that like the social media activism thing is like the way that we're going to actually get there. And I think that like, again, I'm no expert, but I think it's really easy to hurl accusations behind a tiny screen and to not actually do anything in life and to like not have conversation with people. Like I've been told that like I should cut off relationship with my family because they voted politically a different way than I did.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I'm like, why would I do that? Like what is there to gain if I look at these family members and I'm like, you don't believe the way that I do, we can't even talk about it.
Yep.
Like, get out. And I think that that is the trouble that I see with all of this. And I think that, being a Christian, and trying to following the teachings of Christ, that feels the opposite of what I read, and what I take from that tradition. And so it's not like, again, like that black and white thinking is not something that, it's something that I really try to look out for in my own personal life. I know people who are like protesting, celebrating the 4th of July tomorrow. I also know people who are just genuinely so worried for the state of the country and like their lived experience in it that they just can't find it in themselves to celebrate. And I mourn for them, but at the same time, no, not even, but at the same time, I think I do mourn for those people. I respect the people who protest that. I also recognize that if we want to progress from where we are, and if we want to offer the next generation a society that functions in some sort of communal way, then we have to actually do something, and we can't just hurl accusations at each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that functions in a communal way is exactly, that's the issue there that's underneath all that, because if all we do is dismantle that, that leaves us with there's a whole different level of tribalism that's underneath all this, which is every man for himself.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what any of us want. That's not the kind of world I'd prefer to live in. I would prefer for us to be bound by this group identity that says, hey, we're all countrymen. We're all like, we live in the same nation. And like that gives us at least one reason not to slaughter each other.
Yeah. Like this is common ground. Like it is actually common ground.
Yeah. Literally.
We are here together. That is common ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And, and I think that like some of the most beautiful points of my life have been times where I have experienced community, whether that be in a church setting or outside of it. And even more so when you can come alongside people that you don't agree with 100%, and that you can come alongside one another and say, okay, well, we're going to try and do this together anyway.
Yeah. I feel like throughout the conversation, all this stuff, like we've described many things that are understood I'm getting closer and closer to knowing what I'm talking about, but I'm not there yet. But there's this sort of two-sided force that life seems to consist of. A lot of people have observed this in different shapes, in different ways or whatever. There's this balance.
Yeah.
Especially appreciated in more Eastern religions, and all the different shapes it takes. God and the devil, or whatever, Jesus and the devil. Liberalism and conservatism, and masculine and feminine, and all these things. A lot of it seems to be about striking a balance and negotiating with one another, coexisting, striking the perfect balance between forces. And a lot of the conflict I feel like we've been describing, I feel like it's a product of when people are tempted to authoritarianism in a particular direction rather than a balance, like we need it all to be one thing. It all has to be this way. Like what you were talking about with those people who would prefer you not have family members that or whatever. Like That is pretty sick, I think. And
Yeah.
that's just way too far. And that to me is bred from the idea that that's somebody who would say my take on what society should consist of is all society should consist of. There shouldn't be conservatives. There shouldn't
Yeah.
be Trump voters. There shouldn't be liberals. There shouldn't be whatever. I feel like that is like obviously way too far. That's like
Yeah.
we have to get rid of that. We have to like let this shit be secondary
Yeah.
to humanity. Humanity is primary.
Yeah, and what is wild is that is like a controversial statement.
Yeah.
It really is. Or at least it is in some like sectors of social, settings or whatever. But yeah.
Yeah.
And I like have found that it is so easy to like find that balance. And we want to be in like one ditch on one side of the road or the other, and it is actually the hard work to examine multiple perspectives,
Right.
and to remain open. Like that is the hard work of being human. And I think that it's like what all of us, especially in today's society, are being called to. Yeah, I agree. Just saying like it's even funny too, like in the political perspective of it, it's like everyone kind of wants the right to like do what they want to do until someone else is like doing something that they don't want them to do, and that's a really broad statement. And I'm not even speaking to anything specifically except what you said, that like there should be no conservatives. There should be no liberals. This should only be a conservative country, or this should only be a liberal country. And it is like those statements of just like absolute, there is no middle ground. There is no even like political spectrum. You are just this way or you're not.
Yeah.
That I think is one of the things that troubles me the most. And that makes me really sad.
Me too.
Yeah.
I mourn people on both sides of that. And almost as if the people themselves like don't exist. Like when somebody gets that far, I feel like they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And a lot of my relationships with people in north and south of here have suffered because of this, because I just can't take it. I can't like take that. And I prefer to not relate to people in those territories of extremism,
Yeah.
So anyway, with all that said, do you think God is good?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I do.
I think it's cool that you like that's a part of your life or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just like I'm still hoping that someday, like I've learned a very different cramp. I've taken on a very different perspective toward faith over the last few years, and really understand it way more than I ever have before. And so I'm stoked about that. And I don't know, like it's a kind of a breath of fresh air to talk to people who actually still have a place in that world.
Yeah.
And I like have a positive relationship with it.
For sure. I appreciate you saying that. That means a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, I didn't know we were going to talk about any of this.
I know. Who would have thought?
Yeah, I just started with like your new music. So like you have new music coming out more.
Yeah.
So can you remind me one more time when your next single comes out?
My next single, song called Wayside, comes out on July 15th. July 15th.
And what that next Friday?
Is that next Friday?
It is not this coming Friday, but the following.
Yes.
one.
Yeah. Yes.
So this will be out that Monday. So that's great.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Yay. Wait, the Monday after?
The Monday before.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So, and then the album, have you released when that comes out or whatever?
No, but
Okay,
I can. It'll be out in the fall.
There we go. There
yeah,
we go.
in the fall.
In the fall.
Yep.
Good deal. Well, I don't think I even mentioned that you're the genius behind Victoria Vicxtoria.
Hi. If you made it this far, now you know.
Man, thanks for coming over. And
thanks
talking,
for having me.
Thank you for such a rich and surprising conversation.
Oh
as
yeah,
well.
this was delightful.
All right, well, I guess that's it for today. I guess
Cheers.
we'll see you next time. To Jesus.
To Jesus. Amen.